Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Senator John Blake, representing the 22nd Senatorial District. Very proud to represent the people of Lackawanna County and Monroe County and Luzerne County in the 22nd District. And today, very glad to be joined by some very important leaders in the community. I do want to, if I can, acknowledge some folks that are here that work with me in service to the people of Lackawanna County. Way over here to the left in the nice suit is Representative Kyle Mullins. He represents the 112th District. Right here, out of uniform as he says, Representative Mike Carroll, the Dean of the delegation, who represents the 118th District, North Pocono as well as Pittston area. And very, very glad to have my colleagues from the House join me today, so thank you very much. Folks, I want to begin by saying this is an initiative really by the Senate Democratic Caucus. My colleagues throughout the state are actually hosting similar events in their districts in Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, Senator Judy Schwank down in Reading. And so I'm glad to join them in the messaging of this day. So I want to thank you for being here on this little cool but sunny spring day in downtown Scranton to commemorate the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on the 51st anniversary of his tragic assassination in Memphis, Tennessee. An act of senseless violence which has become too commonplace in today's America. Silenced the voice of a generation and a leader of a movement toward a better, stronger, and united country. Dr. King was in Memphis that week in 1968 to support striking sanitation workers who had begun to walk out several weeks earlier to protest unequal wages and working conditions. And here we are in 2019, and many of the same battles that Dr. King fought and the civil and economic injustices that he decried are still with us. Many of his priorities remain undone. They remain challenges even 51 years later. Across the Commonwealth and at all corners of our nation, families are living in poverty, struggling to feed and clothe their families. Government at the federal and at the state level has not been as responsive as it needs to be to local needs in leveraging public funds to build wealth for all citizens through education, job training, affordable housing, and community development. We are one of the richest and most advanced nations in the world, and our citizens and our families all deserve a way out of economic insecurity. So today we will hear from a number of local leaders and advocates about the need to reaffirm our commitment to the messages of Dr. King, to reaffirm our commitment to improve the quality of life for all Pennsylvanians, to respond to the needs of our workers, our families, and our communities struggling with poverty, disinvestment, or marginalization. First, I'd like to introduce Kathy Hardaway, who is the chair of the Greater Scranton MLK Commission. I mentioned to Kathy earlier that normally we would be on the birthday of Dr. King celebrating his life and doing a march, not unlike the marches that he led in the civil rights movement, going to Selma, for instance, in the 1960s. So we got froze out on his birthday, and so we decided we better get together today. Kathy. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Blake. Yeah, we had to cancel our march, and I appreciate Senator Blake's participation in that march every year. But we're here to remember also the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King on April the 4th, 1968. And on April the 3rd, he gave his last sermon in Memphis, and in the church there at Mason Temple in Memphis, he was speaking to a crowd of people willing to listen, willing to hear, and willing to act. And in that speech, he mentioned the Promised Land. And I know some of you thinking Promised Land State Park. I don't know why our state park is named that, but there is a biblical Promised Land. And as a Baptist preacher, Martin Luther King clearly understood the biblical Promised Land, that of the land of Canaan flowing with milk and honey. But this Promised Land that he talked about in 1968 was a land for equal opportunity, fair wages, and an end to poverty. I do thank the Senate Democratic Caucus for hosting this event and calling for 30 days of action to combat poverty and economic security in Pennsylvania. The legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. is about action, and not just about that of Black America. At the Southern Christian Leadership Conference retreat in May of 1967, Martin Luther King stated, "I think it's necessary for us to realize that we've moved from an era of civil rights to an era of human rights." Great strides had been made during that time. We had the passing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Lyndon Johnson's Economic Opportunity Act of 1964, and also the Voting Rights Act of 1965. There was a lot of legislation done during that time, but the struggle continued. When President Lyndon Johnson called for the war on poverty, the national poverty rate at the time in the United States was about 19 to 20%. Today's poverty level is about 12%. Pennsylvania, a little closer to 13%, meaning about 200,000 of our citizens in the Commonwealth, in this great Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, continue to live in poverty. We must continue to strive. We must continue to strive to end poverty and to secure economic security for the citizens of this Commonwealth. In that sermon, his last sermon of April 3rd, 1968, Martin Luther King said, "We've got some difficult days ahead." Still true today, but it doesn't matter with me now, because this was his mountaintop address. He says, "Because I've been to the mountaintop, I'm not concerned now. I would like to live a long life," he said. He said longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. He allowed me to go up to the mountain, and I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. He knew. He said, "I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land." It's been said that Martin Luther King Jr. knew in his spirit that he did not have long to live on this earth. And at times he was discouraged. And at times he even suffered from depression. But he continued to fight. He continued to stand for what is right. We at the Greater Scranton Martin Luther King Commission, with all of our events, we have now a phrase we're beginning to use saying, "The march continues." And I say that to all of us today. We must continue to march, continue to fight, and continue to strive for what is right. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kathy. I want to also acknowledge we've been joined by the newest state representative-elect Bridget Malloy-Kazarowski. Bridget, I want you to know I'm looking forward to Monday so we can start working together for our common constituency, and thank you for being here. Next up, I want to introduce Glynis Johns, who's the founder of Black Scranton. This is the first chance I've had a chance to be in public with Glynis, but I'm delighted that she's taken some time to be with us today, and I'll turn it over to her. Thank you, Glynis.
Excuse me with this wind. I just want to start out by saying that we have a responsibility to preserve the legacy of historical figures on this day. We need to remember this historic man for who he really was. The Black Scranton Project is a local heritage initiative dedicated to archiving and sharing Black history here in Scranton, Pennsylvania. Our mission and advocacy work is influenced by the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King and many others. He knew the power of education. In 1947, while writing for the campus newspaper at Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia, Dr. King argues that education has both a utilitarian and moral function. He wrote in that paper, "The function of education is to teach one to think intensively and to think critically. Intelligence plus character, this is the goal of true education. Education is one of the few ways that we can all work to reclaim our power. But also to learn how to be better allies and better people. Dr. King has transcended into more than just a symbolic spirit. He's more than a man. He's become a civil rights manifesto. We have all embraced and adhered to a selflessness pursuit for justice. Each January and sometimes in April, we remind ourselves that hate cannot drive out hate. We should judge each other on the contents of our character. But too often the power of that legacy is used by white voices to minimize the systematic violence of racism and ultimately to characterize the work of his life to life incomplete rather than to reach, his work to complete his rights rather than to be abandoned. Rather than to shine a light on the parts of our society that need repair, the incredible promise we pretend is in arm's reach is actually yards away. Dr. King's aspirations are used to make invisible the parameters of common violence and the disparities of income, housing, justice, and morality that becomes less acute with time. Since the start of the new year, we have been seeing a shift in our city. For example, just within our own organization, the Black Scranton Project, we decided to celebrate and remember the contributions of the Black community over the past 150 years. We curated a Black History Month exhibit in February that articulated the achievements and the struggles of the Black experience in this anthracite region. We sparked conversation, demystified the origins of the community, and shed light on the racism and marginalization that has kept our community locked in a state of transiency. Today we honor and remember the powerful and enduring legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Dr. King unapologetically combined radical thought, political reason, and oratorical brilliance. I encourage each of you to investigate and research who our local civil rights leaders are and were, and who can carry that baton now. If you can't seem to find those individuals, become the person who makes a difference. That is what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. did. Thank you.
Thank you, Glynis. So we're going to shift a little bit here. We have a friend who's traveled all the way up from South Central Pennsylvania, Steve Herzenberg. Steve is a longtime friend and an advocate in the Capitol. His affiliation is mostly with the Keystone Research Center, but also the Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center, which is a project of Keystone Research, and more recently has been involved in a voice across the state referred to as We the People. Again, I think the agenda that we're talking about here today is about the agenda for economic security. I have workers in my district who go to work in group homes with senior citizens or persons with disabilities or intellectual disabilities who have been in wage stagnation for way too long, barely make enough to take care of their own family. I was with the school district yesterday and found out that the school buildings in Scranton require about $164 million worth of capital improvements just to meet a minimum standard of safety, which means our children and our teachers are walking into schools that are unsafe. How does that help them learn and to succeed in the world? Dr. King would ask us to ask that question very hard to every public policymaker and lawmaker. And I know that Steve has been an advocate for the kinds of issues that we as a caucus champion in Harrisburg every day. So, ladies and gentlemen, Steve Herzenberg.
Hold up my prop here before I try to hold on to it in the wind as I speak.
I'll hold it for you.
Oh, all right. Thank you, Senator. That'd be great. This is
No job too big or too small.
our $15 an hour bill there to symbolize, obviously, the push in the legislature by the Senate Democrats and by the House, many House members, to push for $15 an hour minimum wage in Pennsylvania, which is long overdue. Thank you. As the senator said, I'm with the Keystone Research Center. I'm an economist and the executive director, and also with the Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center. And since last year, with the We the People campaign, which we and partners launched to bring greater visibility to the kind of core economic issues and educational priorities and other priorities that Pennsylvanians need from state policy. Many of the lawmakers here endorsed our We the People agenda as candidates and are now partnering with us to fight to implement that agenda in a legislature still controlled by a majority that still believes in cutting taxes for the rich, keeping wages low, and cutting spending on the education, health care, and other public investments vital to all Pennsylvanians. We are thrilled that the Senate Democrats' 30 days of action will focus on many of the core issues of our We the People agenda, such as economic justice and educational opportunity. I want to focus my remarks on that top priority for lawmakers here, for my organization, and for the We the People campaign, raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour by 2025. To paraphrase Dr. King in his letter from a Birmingham jail, for years now I have heard the word wait. This wait has almost always meant never. Economic justice too long delayed is economic justice denied. It is easy for the 1% and the corporate titans that have continued to see their incomes grow since the 1970s to say, wait for the miracle of trickle down. But African Americans in our country and our state have waited nearly 400 years now for justice. Pennsylvania working families have now waited 40 years for economic justice. And Pennsylvania workers have waited 10 years for an increase in our minimum wage, even while our state lawmakers get automatic increases every single year. We're done waiting. Today, U.S. workers produce 4 times as much as 50 per hour as 51 years ago when Dr. King was assassinated. Yet so little of that has been shared with workers that many in the richest country in the world struggle to get by. In Pennsylvania, even with strong public sector unions, half of sanitation workers today make less than $18 an hour, only enough to cover a basic family budget for one adult with no children. Roughly a third of Pennsylvania's sanitation workers make less than $15 an hour. Lower wage sanitation workers from more rural parts of the state, such as north central Pennsylvania, fare particularly badly. Many make less than $9 an hour compared to $13 per hour at the low end in our neighboring states, all of which have already increased their minimum wage. Constituents in this part of Pennsylvania can't wait any longer for $15 an hour so that they can support their family, grow the local economy by spending more at local businesses, save a little for dinner and a movie, for college, for a rainy day. Folks can find fact sheets on how many Pennsylvanians in each legislative district would benefit from an increase in the minimum wage on the website of Keystone Research Center, www.keystoneresearchcenter.org. 2.2 million Pennsylvania workers would benefit statewide, 40,000 on average in each state Senate district, about 10,000 on average in each state House district. And those of you in the live audience, and those of you at home can drive home the urgency of action now by reaching out to your state representative and your state senator and telling them why you and your neighbors can't wait any longer to get on a path to $15 an hour, one more step to the promised land. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. I didn't think I was going to make that, folks, but I got out all right. Folks, I think you would all agree with me that we ought not be in a situation where a government policy fixes a family in poverty after a 40-hour work week. I think you'd agree that that is unconscionable, but that's what we are doing. Last up, before I wrap things up with a little bit of a discussion about the agenda of the Democratic Caucus, is Julie Shoemaker-Cohen, a Villanova grad, Director of Community and Government Relations with the University of Scranton. Julie was actively involved in a collective effort here, I think among maybe several of our academic institutions, regarding the living wage and the distance between what we're actually, our workers are actually getting paid and what they would need to get paid to live a life of dignity. So with that, Julie.
Well, thank you, Senator Blake, for organizing today's event, and especially honored to be together with such wonderful women leaders. No offense, guys, but Glynis and Kathy are doing wonderful things. So thank you for issuing this call for action to combat poverty and economic insecurity, which is of course so fitting as we commemorate the assassination of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and consider how we can honor his legacy. As others have said, just before his assassination, these were the issues that he was really drawing attention to through the Poor People's Campaign. Through that campaign, he was aiming to bring together poor people from all across the country, from all different backgrounds, to demand better jobs, better homes, better education, and better quality of life. And in that last Sunday sermon that he gave in the spring of 1968, Dr. King said, "We are coming to demand that the government address itself to the problem of poverty. If a man doesn't have a job or an income, he has neither life nor liberty nor the possibility for the pursuit of happiness. He merely exists. We are coming to ask America to be true to this promissory note that it signed years ago." So we know that that call and that demand is still unfinished work throughout the country, but also here in northeastern Pennsylvania. And as Senator Blake said, in 2016, the university worked together with the Institute for Public Policy and Economic Development, and we set about to study what constitutes a living wage here in our region in northeastern Pennsylvania. And with that study, we found a significant gap between a minimum wage, which stands at $7.25 an hour at the state and federal level, and what constitutes a truly living wage income. And we asked the question, how much does it cost to live a modest but dignified life here in our region? We don't want the minimum for our neighbors. We want everyone to be able to have their essential needs met and have educational and employment opportunities available. At the heart of the study for us as a Catholic and Jesuit institution was also a belief in the dignity of every human person, a belief in the dignity of work, and the right to a just wage. We also talked with many of Scranton's social service agencies and heard from them about the difficult choices and compromises that many of their clients are facing, who may have to give up things like a meal in exchange for paying for rent and utility bills. And we know in our local school district here in Scranton, more than 80% of children qualify for free or reduced lunch because of their parents' income level. And so those meals are maybe the best healthy meal they have in a day. Currently, 1/3 of households in Lackawanna and Luzerne counties make less than $25,000 per year, and yet with almost all the family classifications we looked at, that is very far from a living wage income. So what do? We did not feel hopeless as a result of this study. We identified some concrete actions that I think are being undertaken, and we also prioritized community collaboration. We do need to find ways to raise wages through workforce development, economic development, and also through increases to the minimum wage. We need to adequately fund and expand existing social service programs and support tax credits for low-income families. And one of our biggest takeaways really was that we do all have a role to play. We need government, we need business, we need nonprofits, we need individual and collective action. I think we have such a generous spirit that runs throughout the Scranton community. So what more can we do together? So we did not find a lack of a living wage inevitable. We did not find the challenge insurmountable, especially if we consider the well-being of our neighbor as integral to our own well-being and really think about pursuing the common good. We will actually be updating this living wage study in the coming year and thinking more about what we can do to ensure that a larger share of northeastern Pennsylvanians are able to live a modest and dignified life. I think that's what Dr. King was aiming for in 1968 before his life was cut short, and what we should all continue to work for today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Julie. So folks, I want to kind of wrap things up if I can. I know all of you are shivering a little, especially these wonderful women up here and Steve, but we've talked today about the legacy of Dr. King. We've heard about the urgent need for better social equality, and we've heard the troubling statistics about the gap between our minimum wage and the living wage. So now is the time for action, for us to work together to carry the legacy of Dr. King and to really start to change our communities and really maybe change the attitude in our Capitol building. Along with my colleagues in the Pennsylvania Democratic Caucus, we're calling for 30 days of action to combat poverty and address economic insecurity. Call your friends wherever they may live in Pennsylvania, because they all have lawmakers that represent them, and try to get this message through to them. We have really very important legislative initiatives that can improve the lives of those who continue to struggle for financial security. And I will be introducing legislation in the future to fund our statewide housing trust fund. We have heard from PHFA that if I just dedicated a $5 million a year funding stream, it could support a bond issue in the current market of up to $70 million to fund our statewide housing trust fund. I began my career in public life, as many of you know, as a redevelopment authority executive director in Lackawanna County, and most of my work at that time was in affordable housing. We wrote grants. We got grants from the federal government, CDBG money, home funding, emergency shelter grants to try to improve people's living conditions. We used to, at one point, do about 100 homes a year. We don't do anything near that now, ladies and gentlemen, not even close. I'll be reintroducing legislation to establish the Veterans Housing Assistance Program to assist our homeless veterans, which is really an urgent imperative. We have other bills introduced, including the issue of livable wages, which you've heard, safe staffing levels for our nurses. I really was very, very happy to join my colleague, Senator Maria Collette, in trying to have Pennsylvania join several other states that have come around to the fact that our hospitals need to guarantee there are sufficient nurses to deal with the number of patients that they're asked to care for. It's really a public safety issue. It's a quality outcome issue. And it's about these nurses and stress and burnout. And it's about their fear of losing the license that they dedicated their life to achieve because of poor management decisions. We need to do something better there. There's also a number of bills that deal with education, folks. It's the best investment we make for early childhood education and for pre-K and Head Start. And our caucus are strong championships for that. The governor has been dealing with this issue of trying to build wealth through workforce development, apprenticeship programs, investment in people's opportunity to transition, not only younger workers, but adult workers that are transitioning in a changing economy. So these are ambitious undertakings, but social justice, fair wages, and access to quality education are what we're about today as we commemorate the tragedy of losing Dr. King. You've heard a lot of quotes from him today, and I'm going to have to finish with one today. Dr. King remarked in his final speech, "Let us rise up with a greater readiness. Let us stand with greater determination. Let us move on in these powerful days, these days of challenge, to make America what it ought to be." Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Appreciate you being here. And I want to thank all of our speakers today. Thank you very much.